Hi, I'm Alex.
And I'm Eddie.
Welcome to the 6th episode of Catch 52, a politics podcast brought to you by WDSR, Duquesne Student Radio.
We are now 45 weeks away from inauguration, and we are now walking away from what we like to call Duper Tuesday, where we had another, I believe, 7 states vote alongside some other territories, and wow.
That's right. It was the second Super Tuesday, and it was the second Super Tuesday quite literally in every sense of the word. Exactly the same thing happened.
Yes.
Well, not exactly the same thing, but the same narrative came out of it. And so we'll talk. So today we're going to talk a little bit about that, but then because of the results of this second Super Tuesday, we're going to be talking about who we believe is the new presumptive nominee for the Democratic Party, former Vice President Joe Biden.
Yeah, so to begin, if you look at the two biggest states that voted, Michigan and Washington, you see two very, very big stories. So first in Michigan, what you saw was following an endorsement from Pete and Amy and then Kamala Harris and also Cory Booker and also the mayor or the governor of Michigan, Biden won in a pretty astounding victory in what was a state that Bernie surprisingly won in 2016.
Yes, it was. Michigan has not necessarily had a history of picking winners. The past few elections have been. Obama won in 2012. Hillary Clinton actually won in 2008, which is why it was a little bit surprising when Michigan went all the way from the conservative wing of the party in 2008
Yes.
to then after to now. Voting for Bernie, well, not now. So voting for Bernie Sanders in 2016, and then going back for Joe Biden in 2020.
Yeah, it was quite a shocking event. And then also in Washington, you also saw something pretty surprising in that it's not fully reporting in right now, but it's pretty neck and neck. But right now, Biden has about a 20,000 delegate lead as of recording on Thursday.
20,000?
20,000 out of 800,000 votes.
A 20,000 vote lead.
Yeah.
What's his lead in delegates?
Right now, it's a 1 delegate lead.
There we go.
So it's neck and neck right there in Washington. But what we did see is in basically every other state and every other territory, we saw Joe Biden win.
And in some cases, he was winning big because of logistical reasons. Other cases, he won in states where it wasn't expected for him to win. For example, Joe Biden wins Washington State.
Yes.
Big shocker.
And now 538 puts it at a greater than 99 in 100 chance that Joe Biden will become the nominee. That's quite shocking since since about 2 weeks into February, he was around a 7% chance of becoming the nominee. It's really skyrocketed in the past few weeks.
And I don't know if there's any precedent for this. I mean, is there really any precedent for primary politics? But this is a comeback that we really this is a kind of comeback that I dare I say we haven't seen since Richard Nixon. I mean, the comparison is there. Apologies for my mic; it's doing weird things. But the comparison is there for Richard Nixon as far as somebody whose political career really skyrocketed. Joe Biden falls off the map when he elects not to run in 2016, and then literally like rising like the phoenix from the ashes with the help of Jim Clyburn in South Carolina, whose legacy will forever now be cemented, for better or worse, as the guy who brought Joe Biden back to life.
So if you'll remember in our first episode, we mentioned just a quick little game to play where name one of Donald Trump's policies, and off the top of your head, you're already thinking of at least 2 or 3.
Build the wall.
Build the wall, lock her up, whatever other chants that they had, any of the things he said, and also then to name one Hillary policy. And you couldn't.
Yes.
So we were talking and we said, let's name one Joe Biden policy. And we realized there was a similar problem. And actually, if you look at his hiring website on lever.co, you can see that he is currently hiring policy analysts.
Yes. And first things first, let's put aside for a moment, like John Oliver, let's put aside this thing that is really important. The idea that, imagine running for president of the United States and you only decide to have policies after 11 months of
11
running.
months. He declared his campaign late April. To be fair, he's had a policy director this whole time, But right now
But
was
really,
when
have they
he's
been doing anything?
at least hiring. He's hiring at least one policy analyst. We
Oh,
can't
okay,
say
that's good.
we can't say for the insides of the campaign how many they really need, but we do know there is a need right now on the campaign for more policies. So we figured, hey, let's dive into their policies. Let's see what Joe has in store for us.
So come with us as we dive deep. And if you'd like to follow us, you can go to joebiden.com/Joe's Vision. That's Joe's Vision. And so we'll be going through the list of Joe's policies that you can see there on that website.
Yeah.
And talking about them. We've been researching them ever since they've been released for the few weeks that they've been out there. But let's just start with the overall policies, because I think that in a primary that may have been originally driven by ideas. I mean, the party is pretty much split by healthcare, almost exclusively healthcare, in my opinion. You had candidates really coming at it from a lot of different issues. You had a lot of single-issue candidates. Swalwell seemed to be a single-issue gun control candidate. You had Jay Inslee, who was a single-issue climate change candidate.
Yes.
On top of that, what else? There were a bunch. Julian Castro,
immigration,
single-issue immigration candidate. So you had a list of these. You had a bunch of these candidates who really looked like they were getting into the race from a cynical point of view. They were getting into the race solely to draw attention to these kind of policy ideas. Again,
and possibly get that cabinet appointment to the respective position.
Cabinet appointment as well. You can say the same thing about Yang when it comes to UBI. So that said, let's think about Joe Biden's policies. Are these policies that are bringing together all these disparate ideas of the Democratic Party, or do these policies represent the will of the corporate Democratic establishment?
So if you go to his that page, you look at the first policy he has, the most important policy listed first, not by alphabetical order, not by anything. The first plan there is the Biden plan for Central America.
Oh my God. Nothing says getting Americans to vote for your campaign like saying that we're going to fix another country.
Having a plan for Central America is definitely a good sign.
Sure.
But I'm curious as to the programmer of this website why you'd put Central America first.
Why? Now, okay, sure, the formatting doesn't draw a ton of attention to it, but it's the first policy. There's one possible explanation for this that is somewhat rational, and I'd like to get your take on this. We have said repeatedly, we've said it once already on this episode, that Trump's first policy is build the wall, right?
Yeah.
When you start talking about build the wall, it inevitably ends up talking about problems happening in Central America.
Sure.
So is that the reason why that's the Biden's first policy, or do you think it's just dumb?
That definitely makes sense, considering also the second policy is immigration and the third policy is infrastructure. If you think
why is the third policy infrastructure? That's what what annoys me.
That it would make much more sense for it to be the first policy, if anything, in my mind. But,
yes.
But what you do see is, it does make sense that his first thing is framing himself not as a counter to Bernie, but as a counter to Trump.
Yes, and if that is his, this mic. I am sorry if you're hearing this. We're working off of a new mic, and it is just popping like crazy. So. The first two. So if he's establishing himself as a foil to Trump, saying we're going to have either like a constructivist or a neoliberal plan to fix American immigration, you need a plan for Central America. So that makes a lot of sense to me. But still, I feel like the consensus for the past 8 years is that the Democrats are going to run on rebuilding America, and saying that that's the third point of your campaign is not a great sell.
Yeah, and especially considering you do hear a lot of Republicans talking about, oh, the Democrats don't care about America, they care more about the Mexicans. Your first policy being Central America isn't the best look. But anyways, let's look at what that policy actually is.
Let's stop hating on it for a second.
So the main part is investing $4 billion into Central American nations to help them basically establish their own rule of law there.
Mm-hmm. And this is something that I feel like I don't feel like we've heard Democrats talk about a lot, but it does seem like something that is right out of the Democratic playbook in a sense. Invest money, do some nation building, build up the State Department, bring back sort of the careerists. Doesn't seem is $4 billion, is that a lot? Is that not enough?
He doesn't really say. He doesn't give much context for what that $4 billion is, what we've given in the past. So I'm not exactly sure, but I mean, considering one of the biggest accusations in Central America is that there is a lot of corruption, I don't know if giving more money to the government will necessarily fix anything.
I think that's now I think that's an incredibly fair point, especially when we if you just to look at Venezuela. I feel like we're past the point of soft power by now, and even if one of the two presidents, Juan Guaido, manages to take over the country, even then it's questionable at best, and especially when you have so much sort of extortion that is rampant throughout those economies. I think it's going to be very challenging for an investment oriented strategy. But it's something that isn't overtly racist, which I guess is pretty refreshing in that sense.
So what he also does, though, to be fair, is he does have a section on combating corruption. And the main thing is that, cutting visas and freezing assets of any corrupt individuals from Latin American countries. And then also, working on new offices in the Treasury Department to investigate that corruption and, just general anti-corruption mechanisms, which is definitely a reasonable approach to the whole issue.
Absolutely, and he actually calls out the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Asset Control, OFAC, which I personally love. I think OFAC is one of the most important offices that nobody has ever heard of because it has the power to freeze assets, and because the dollar is effectively the global reserve currency, that is a very important power that can be wielded with a lot of muscle. So if Biden is going to empower and weaponize asset control, I think that would be wonderful. That said, when it comes to talking about corruption, a lot of that is not. I mean, you can talk about big time corruption happening in dollars, but really, if we're talking about the root causes of a lot of these problems, which is sort of petty crime, local extortion, things like that, human trafficking, that's not something where asset freezing is exactly going to get that job done. That's where the nation building comes in.
A lot of that is illicit, but there's only so much you can do, and I think that's a pretty good first step. So moving on, the next policy is immigration.
So now if we're talking about this, good Lord. So now if we're just talking about this in terms of like order of our discussion, this actually makes perfect sense as sort of his next plan. And the immigration plan that he's got is you could say it's a little bit of a mashup of everything that the Democrats wanted.
It's pretty much taken straight from the Democratic Party platform.
However, there is sort of one thing to note regarding its position between the progressives and between the moderates, and it's that at no point does Biden's website call for abolishing ICE or Customs and Border Patrol.
Yeah, so that's definitely siding on the more moderate side. And again, definitely trying to appeal more to the Hillary Trump voters than to the Bernie bros.
Absolutely, and it's actually saving down ballot candidates as well, not forcing them to defend somebody who's calling for the abolishing of ICE.
Yeah, so the problem with having a candidate that wants to abolish ICE is the same problem with the possibility of losing votes down ballot with a more radical candidate, in that they might see, oh, this president wants to, abolish ICE and let all the illegals in. What you'd see then is them not want to vote for the Congress that would have to approve that funding. So they'd be voting Republican up and down ballot versus Democratic up and down ballot, even if the Democrats might closer represent their policy views.
Yep. Now, getting past sort of the ICE point, we can also talk about what Biden will be doing that is clearly a Democratic point.
So if you read just the bullet points right away, it says, take urgent action to undo Trump's damage and reclaim America's values.
Yeah.
Modernize our immigration system, welcome immigrants in our communities, reassert our commitment to asylum seekers and refugees, et cetera, et cetera. It's pretty much the straightforward Democratic Party platform of pro-immigration, but also not in the current
very
setup.
very sort of very how to put this, it's very it's flatly pro-immigration, and the thing that I was looking for that I couldn't find anywhere was I couldn't tell if he was calling for merit-based immigration, which is a sort of traditional conservative point of view, maybe neoconservative, or talking about more family-based or more just sort of refugee-oriented immigration.
Yeah.
And this is a really interesting issue because it's not only something that until quite recently the Democratic Party didn't give much thought to, but the traditional conservative perspective is let's have more merit-based immigration, right? So let's have more immigrants who are paying higher taxes. They're not necessarily going to be dependent on entitlement programs, the welfare system. And they'll be here. So like immigrants who are coming over with skills for white collar jobs. Whereas, and the other interesting thing that I thought was weird is that until quite recently, Bernie was pretty anti-immigrant,
Mhm.
especially because he said that immigrants would lower wages for American workers.
Yeah. So actually, looking at his website here, it does say that he wants each day he does like keeping family ties as a immigration policy active. So it's probably leaning towards more familial immigration policy versus merit-based immigration policy.
And that's
The
kind of
word
what I expected.
yeah, the word merit only shows up once in his entire thing. That's talking
Okay.
about the merit of asylum cases.
Sure. So the interesting thing about family-based immigration is that allows for a conservative talking point, chain migration. But I feel like you can run on Trump against chain migration because of Melania.
Yeah, and you can also run on Trump against chain migration because of the children put in the cages. But it's a pretty easy counter to say, oh, they're trying to chain migrate, and then you just say, no, we're just trying to not put the children in the cages.
Or you can say they're trying to chain migrate, and then Trump's like, well, I don't like chain migration, and then Joe Biden can be like, well, Melania used chain migration.
to
Deal
get
with
her
it.
family there.
The
Yeah.
one last thing that we'll talk about regarding Biden's immigration plan that I love
Mhm.
is it explicitly says that they're going to double immigration personnel across the board. That's not only ICE agents. Well, I don't know if it doubles ICE agents, but it talks about Customs and Border Patrol agents.
Mhm.
But really, it talks about funding public defenders. It talks about doubling the number of immigration courts, which is
Yeah.
exactly what we need.
Because right now there is a huge the bureaucratic reason that the children were locked in the cages was because there were not enough immigration court judges, court staff, anything like that. So there was a huge backlog, and because of that, the waiting time that a parent could be held with their child was, I think, only 2 weeks. And while that was not always enforced, the Trump administration enforced that. And so because there was such a backlog, the children and their parents were separated because the parents were held in a detention center or in a jail, whereas the kids just stayed in the detention center.
So let's not have a question of unconstitutional behavior, but at the same time, not only can we give more qualified people jobs, increasing the number of judges does that. I'm just riffing on that. But really what it does is it's going to speed everything up, which is, at the end of the day, what literally everybody wants.
Yeah, I don't think that a single person would say, oh, no, we need our immigration process to stay slow. Even people who are anti-immigration would probably like to see more immigrants rejected faster or less qualified immigrants rejected faster, to phrase it a little lighter.
It doesn't do anybody any good.
Yeah.
All right.
So moving on, next is infrastructure.
All right. Well, let's spend a decent amount of time talking about
Yeah,
infrastructure because not only so you've got infrastructure. With that, you have a lot of different points, and Biden's infrastructure policy, I think, brings them together quite well.
His infrastructure is definitely his most well thought out, and there's a good bunch there, probably a couple thousand words written on his infrastructure in different policy areas.
And not only does it include policy, it include talking points regarding just purely infrastructure, like we're going to build this much roads with this much money. But it also includes talking about how it's going to be done.
Yeah.
Sustainability provisions, labor protections, empowering unions, the kind of people and the kind of work that it's going to be.
It's actually
well thought out.
It's a very impressive plan. So the main overall or overarching thing is that over the next 10 years, he wants to invest $1.3 trillion into the infrastructure.
1.3 trillion.
1.3 trillion, which,
correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't the last in 2016 they ran on like 50 billion? Is that
I
what?
think it's quite it's really ramping it up, but
awesome.
you know, and if you really want to modernize America's infrastructure to where, say, Europe is, you need a good bunch of money to do that. I mean, if you look at American roads, the Germans have a saying called "American good enough." That, you know, you might see a few cracks in the road or, you know, a little chip out of the tunnel, but it's good enough. It's not. There's no pothole. There are no, you know, buses falling into the middle of the street like we had
don't
in
be
Pittsburgh.
coming at Pittsburgh like that.
So, you know, that's his big thing. And another very interesting thing is that he has this plan for his environment. And he wants
I love this so much.
So he wants to invest in public transit, invest in electric cars, build a high-speed rail network, and accelerate development of low-carbon aviation and shipping.
Now, say what look. Say what you will about it's going to take a really long time to build on all that stuff. Number one, that's why it's 1.3 trillion over 10 years.
Yes.
130 billion a year is a lot of money.
It is.
But if it's going toward things that are going to pay for themselves, like high-speed trains,
Electric cars.
Actually, I think the thing that we haven't mentioned yet that is really going under the radar is broadband.
Yeah.
Not only does there need to be more funding for broadband, but we have to support companies that are in that industry that aren't able to afford moving into rural regions. Rural broadband is going to revitalize, or at least as much
Yeah.
as one can, revitalize rural America, which has all these things going against it. Like, it hasn't seen population growth in like 100 years.
Yeah.
It hasn't seen
We'll
really
get-
significant investment.
Yeah.
The internet is the great equalizer. It has been for the past 25 years. And if rural broadband can get going in a way that is actually that goes within the existing legal provisions of the FCC and isn't run by Sprint and T-Mobile as a monopoly, I feel like it can be really good.
So we will get into that more later when we get to the rural section. Basically, those $1.3 trillion are going into clean water, roads, broadband, schools, transportation, and other just like buildings, public works, stuff like that. But again, to go back to what I was saying earlier, public transit, electric cars, high-speed rails, and the development of low-carbon aviation and shipping.
No more Amtrak deaths. 2020.
So, in case you don't know what those plans constitute, he basically has copied and pasted this from a little plan known as the Green New Deal. But the thing is, the words Green New Deal do not show up at all in his policy page. Which,
gotta hand it to Biden. He hired some good people.
Yeah,
at least
which
for this.
is, very, very impressive. Since for whatever reason, Green New Deal has been spun into a very communistic.
They're gonna
clause
outlaw cheeseburgers.
where they're going to outlaw cheese and cows and make you and force you to fly on planes that you don't want to go on and stuff like that. It's been really fear-mongered, super successful from Fox News and
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said that her biggest regret in Congress is how the Green New Deal was introduced.
yeah. So basically, what Joe's done here is turned it into just a much more moderate, normal-sounding thing where he instead of calling it a Green New Deal, he just lists out the policies, and for whatever reason, it kind of goes against typical political theory where you have a snap name for it, the ACA, and it'll stick. I mean, Obamacare it started off as a negative thing, but it turned out into a very positive term that a lot of Americans view
Hands
favorably.
off my Obamacare.
Like so things like that with a quick, easy to remember name typically do really well, but this seems to kind of reverse that because it comes off as a much more moderate, eco-friendly infrastructure revitalization program when really it's the Green New Deal.
It is the Green New Deal. There's a caveat to it, though, and when we go into the climate policy, we're going to have to talk about it. But in his climate policy, he says that they can only guarantee net zero emissions by 2050, which frankly is unacceptable.
I think the Green New Deal was aiming at 2030.
2030 is the timeline that we don't have it. We have to be 2030.
Yeah, no, 2050 is basically by 2050, if we don't make major changes, we're going to probably not have Washington D.C. above water.
I think I thought that was 2030, but I mean 2050 is like the hard point.
Yeah,
but we need to. The United States has to be drastically reduced by 2030.
There are a lot of different estimates. The main estimate that the Democrats have been using is that by 2030 there will be substantial changes. By 2050 there will be life-altering changes.
Yes, that sounds about right.
Yeah. So that's his infrastructure plan. It's pretty well versed. I definitely recommend if you have taking the time to read it. It's a very well thought out plan.
Yeah, it's a lot like Jay Inslee's Evergreen Plan.
Yes.
Again, if you have time, I don't know if that website is still up, but if it is, go read it. He's got 45 pages of climate change policy. It's beautiful.
Yeah. So moving on, the next two are on veterans and military families.
Biden's strength. He ends every speech with "May God defend our troops." That's the one thing he'll never mess up. And so at the end of the day, Biden is going to have the vets covered, and it's just a question of, is this going to be able to be pitched in such a way that is going to get a majority of veterans to support it and say, this is a good thing?
Yes.
I have no idea.
It's definitely a pretty, again, one thing you'll find with Biden's policies is they don't stray very far away from the typical Democratic platform.
Yeah, that's true. Which, I mean, it's
not a bad thing.
It's not a bad thing because the typical Democratic platform is something that I personally agree with.
Yeah, his
mostly.
policies, the Democratic platform is marketed towards a moderate American.
Yes.
And so are most of his policies. Most of them, again, are pretty unremarkable. Like we mentioned earlier, investing in infrastructure.
Hey, everybody wants that.
Like a flatly pro-immigration policy that helps increase America's growth. Like just pretty forward stuff that you'd assume Joe thinks. We'll get into some of his more impressive stuff in a second, but Let's address the veteran stuff first.
So, like most of his policies, rather than opening up with saying what he's going to do, it opens up with like 4 paragraphs about all the stuff that he's done in the past.
yes,
And regarding what he is proposing, again, it faces the challenge of, doesn't this require congressional approval? Which, of course, everything does, but
Yeah.
it's good to at least look at it. So there's a lot of targeted military technology investment. I feel like if this stuff goes through in the form that it's been presented to us on this website, you're going to see a lot more contracts, but contracts that I think are well-deserved, awarded to a lot of military technology companies.
yeah,
So investing in like Humvees that have, armor that will protect them from IEDs, more things like body armor, investing in cyber, which is something the Navy has been requesting for literally 10 years, and then Trump gave them an aircraft carrier instead. Hey, we want better computers and better, more money to pay people
Yeah.
who do computer science. How about a boat?
So what he's done is basically listen to the DoD. There are, I believe it was the DoD that requested this much money, and the Trump administration gave them more. Basically, the DoD said this is what we need to operate. Like, this is the most we can use to operate well. Like, this is if we can get this much, this will be perfect. And he gave them a few billion more than that.
Yeah.
It seems like what Joe's been doing here is actually listening to what the DoD says that they need, which is
Yes.
a very good thing.
And so, in addition to that kind of investment, it is sort of the first platform that really has begun addressing life after service in a
Yes.
significant way, because you have because right now you have
18 years of troops that are going to be coming back
yes
and readjusting to life. I mean, they've been coming back for now probably 15, 16 years, and
they are reintegrated in society to a certain
largely,
extent,
but
but
we-
not
you
not
still
a
see
lot.
you see higher than average numbers of veteran homelessness, veteran
Yes.
addiction, veteran suicide, veteran unemployment. Basically, any negative statistic, veterans are higher up than any average than
That's
any
absolutely
other
right.
than most average Americans.
I read an article in the Pittsburgh Post Gazette recently. Actually, they interviewed Alejandro Villanueva, who's a left guard, I think. Don't quote me on that. Who's an offensive lineman for the Steelers.
He's the one that
He's
came out during the
Yeah.
Pledge of Allegiance or the national anthem when the rest of the Steelers stayed inside during the whole kneeling controversy.
Yeah, because veteran, gotta respect.
Yeah, he's a veteran.
Point being, he was interviewed by the Pittsburgh Post Gazette because he was, as an example, and there were a few other veterans who were interviewed, as one of the combat troops who was deployed in Afghanistan, who has come home and has really started questioning what the heck is going on there. And
Yeah.
he is quoted saying that like he lost sight of the mission, is not aware really of what's going on. It was kind of a depressing read. And so that seems, and then the article, of course, extrapolates saying that this is like generally considered to be a viewpoint held by a lot of veterans who have come back from Afghanistan, Iraq less so. Point being, they need reintegrated into society
Yeah.
because they deserve it, and because if this is starting to become a psychological phenomenon among those veterans, that is not a good sign.
So most of the plan revolves around just improving the VA. Basically, everything in his plan is to improve the VA, which is definitely needed. The VA has one of the highest approval ratings out of any of the healthcare systems in America.
Yeah, but
it's
you
still
hear
deeply
people,
flawed.
you hear people who come on talk nothing but crap about it.
Yeah, it's
The VA and the waiting times.
people will talk crap about it, but also if you ask them, do they view it favorably, they'll say yes. It's a very interesting thing. It's a pretty standard American thing.
That's fair.
But
That's
anyways,
fair.
there's a lot of problems with enrollment, especially among minorly disabled members. So the way enrollment works is it bases the whole thing on how disabled you are and whether you got that disability in or outside of the military. So if you are ruled as 100% disabled by the VA, which means like you cannot get by without help from the VA, and it was in a combat, you get first registration. And then after that, it's not many people, so they go to the people that are 90% and then 80%, etc. So those people who made it out but don't necessarily have an injury or are only minorly injured or like it's only quote unquote only PTSD. Like that's only I think a 10% or something like that if it's not a severe case.
Okay.
So their odds of enrolling in a good plan are much lower. So
The other thing that it does,
Yes.
yeah, and it's sort of I am a fan of this. it talks about roping in the Department of Defense benefit plan with
Yes,
the Veterans Affairs plan,
which is
with veterans plans. In the
very
VA.
good because right
that,
now
to me is wild that, at least in my opinion, DoD civilian employees seem to have. I don't want to call it a better plan than veterans because it isn't and it shouldn't be, but it certainly seems like they do. They have It's just the DoD civilians for the most part aren't risking their lives. They're not as likely to have all of these horrible things happen to them.
No, certainly not in the same numbers or even percentages.
Exactly, but there's a lot of things in DoD plans that are really good. Like it's very, very comprehensive healthcare, but it's not I don't want to call it comprehensive healthcare. It's very, very comprehensive for when majorly bad things happen to you. So heart attacks, for example, DoD is their healthcare package is great for covering like major things that happen, but it's not very good for like preventative care. So if there's a way where that can be sort of combined, that would be great. The second part of DoD benefits package that I love that it seems like the website is talking about is giving them access to what is effectively the DoD civilian 401k plan.
Yeah,
and so that I think is great. I won't go too much into it, but it really gives a person freedom with where they want to put their money.
Yeah,
and it gives them a lot of protection. It's one of the only investment funds that I've ever looked into that is incredibly robust while also maintaining a lot of like individual liberty for the investor.
And that whole idea of it being robust but adding individual liberty, we will get into much more when we get to his healthcare plan, which we still haven't gotten to as we move on to our sixth policy plan, which is the unions. Because Joe loves his unions.
And this is pretty much your standard fare. There is a really, really interesting quote that he opens his union page with that I want to talk about. He opens it with this, right? The $15 billion a year thing?
Yeah.
Okay, so he opens the page with this.
Or it's close to the top.
Employers steal $15 billion a year from working people by paying workers less than the minimum wage. How is that on Joe Biden's website? That sounds like it's coming out of an AOC policy platform.
It does. He uses a lot of left-leaning language in this page, which is pretty impressive, but it is what largely appeals to most of the union workers, not unionists. That's a very different thing. That appeals to the union workers. And, his plans are pretty, Obama, Biden, Democrat type thing. Having the people's right to organize, protecting that, making sure. He wants to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour also, which,
I don't. Okay, we'll talk about this in a future episode. I disagree fundamentally with raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour.
There's an interesting. There's a good argument from an economist perspective to say that, but the reasoning behind it is that right now the current minimum wage is not enough to sustain a living. It's I think
this is
$25,000 a year if you work full time on minimum wage.
And there's all these charts that you can look at that show that when the minimum wage was introduced, which is I believe Great Depression or World War II era, if you had just indexed the minimum wage, meaning you peg it to inflation and then you just let it go, the minimum wage right now would be something like $25 an hour.
Yeah, it would.
In at least $20 an hour, I know that. My reason for saying that the $15 minimum wage is a bad idea is because I feel like that would really impact rural businesses. There are some places where where it needs to be $15 an hour. Places like DC, places like Seattle, things like that, where there's a lot more money going around and that can be sustained. However, you can see wages actually organically going up. The lower wages organically rising, especially in the past few years. Just to look at some service sector industries, Target, for example, has pledged to raise their minimum wage to $13 an hour over the next few years.
$15 an hour, actually.
$15 an hour. We don't need that personally is an issue where I don't think the federal government needs to get involved. It's something where I disagree with Biden's position on, but like it's a standard Democrat position.
Yeah,
I worry about it a little bit,
especially a pro-union Democrat.
Yeah, that's weird though, because $15 an hour actually, because doing that might actually impact collective bargaining leverage. But if
he wants to add extra protections to collective bargaining.
He wants to. He's he's adding
So,
protections to collective bargaining.
what
So
you
if
see-
that's the plan, Jesus God, this
Yeah,
mic.
what you see is a lot of actual like minutia in this one, very similar to the
Mhm.
infrastructure. He has a lot written. It goes pretty in depth to like contractual like clauses that can and can't be, added, and non-compete clauses, non-poaching agreements, stuff like that.
Yes.
It's a robust plan, but we're also low on time, and we still have a good bunch of plans
all
to
right.
go. So we're gonna move on.
Next thing, campaign finance.
Yeah, so campaign finance reform is not necessarily exactly the typical Democratic platform, but it definitely
Look,
is,
it deserves
is
to
playing
be there.
the same notes.
It deserves to be there.
Yes, it's a well written plan. So
The key to that plan is
Yes.
Joe Biden, I am surprised to say it, is calling for a constitutional amendment.
a constitutional amendment to restrict super PACs and overturn Citizens United.
Good for Joe.
This is especially surprising considering he has a super PAC that is funded by not necessarily people. But
Fight
that
fire with
said,
fire.
Yeah, fighting fire with fire is, I guess, a good thing.
And there is some really promising things that even if there's not a constitutional amendment, he's talking about a provision to match donations. I've seen anywhere from just individual matching of small donations.
Yeah,
We're talking
so
up to
this is the
$27,
federal
something like that.
government giving money to candidates to match donations, so they don't need as much money from people.
Yeah.
Basically, the goal of this would to be slowly moving back towards what McCain-Feingold wanted, in
Right.
that it would give McCain-Feingold, what the initial plan was to completely publicly fund elections. It would give a certain amount to each candidate over time for whatever based on whatever campaign they're running, and that's all the money they can use. And that would save, I think, a few $1 billion every 4 years, or a few $100 million at least every 2 years. In donations to political campaigns. Basically, everyone pays like 7 cents, and you can fund a presidential campaign.
Right. He's also pushing for loopholes being closed in legislation that talks about campaign disclosures, things like that, decreasing the power of lobbyists. Very standard Democratic platform that didn't exist until quite recently, but that I personally feel needs to be there and needs to be something that we all push for.
That's
for the
one
next few
thing that
years.
you didn't even see really until until Bernie started pushing for it in 2016, when he was running for the people and not for the businesses. And when Ben and Jerry, but not Ben and Jerry's, endorsed Bernie Sanders, and and then you saw Beto run without PACs, and you saw a bunch of people like that became the new thing, the new like.
Until
if you're
Warren
a
ran with
progressive,
PACs.
if you're a progressive Democrat, you run without a PAC, and
That's what you do.
so this would look to basically solidify that into law, that you have to run without a PAC, and that would also probably significantly hurt a lot of big money Republican candidates that get a lot of money from businesses, which isn't definitely not every Republican. Don't get me wrong, but there are a few candidates that, if you look on Open Secrets, do get a lot of money from PACs.
Orrin Hatch.
Yeah.
All
Who's
right.
no
So
longer.
moving on, because campaign finance, pretty self-explanatory. Education. This
Yes.
is a podcast brought to you by Duquesne University. Let's talk about education, because this is something where Biden definitely splits.
Yeah. So
And
this
we
is
have to talk about that.
kind of taking Hillary's view and expounding on it and making it slightly farther left.
Yes. So Biden is calling for 2 years of free community college. He's calling for $60 billion of investment into historically black colleges, but also 2-year colleges
And trade schools as
and
well.
trade schools. Thank you. He specifically has a section dedicated to calling out the Dreamers, saying that Dreamers will be able to use this infrastructure.
Mhm.
I'm not sure. I'm assuming when they're citizens. I'm assuming, but I'm not sure. He talks about there's a provision that I am a big fan of that talks about forgiving debt for very, very poor, for low-income Americans who
Yes.
can't afford to pay. And this is the big one for students that they need to pay attention to. And your support from Biden will probably come from this point. The policy that he's proposing is revamping payment plans across the board, which I'm a big fan of. And according to Biden's plan, 5% of a student's discretionary income, a student will have to pay after they graduate 5% of their discretionary income past $25,000 on their loans. So that is
if you're making over 20, if you're making
Yes.
under 25, you don't need to make payments, essentially.
yeah.
And if you're making over 25,000 a year, you only need to pay 5% of that towards your loans is what he's saying.
And this is the interesting thing, and this could go a lot of different ways. He's calling for loan forgiveness after 20 years of payments.
Yeah.
Regardless of the fact. So this is going to have to be really, really heavily fleshed out, and I feel like we need to devote an episode to it.
And that's also very important because what you saw was with the first federal student debt, in whatever the student debt forgiveness program was, that you saw a lot of controversy over it when the first class of those people that graduated 20 years ago graduated, and a lot of them found out they took out the wrong loan or they weren't paying exactly enough. So having a much simpler plan that includes all loans will definitely help.
SoFi just invested in a PAC to start to lobby against Biden exclusively because of this, and I hope they get destroyed by it.
So generally, I think supporting a candidate that SoFi does not is probably a good deal.
Oh, but you can't hate SoFi. They do marketing for students and networking. Ooh, so networking so that you can get a job and start paying us back faster. All right, enough on that. Gun violence is up next.
So this is something Joe really needs to straddle the line on.
Oh, yeah.
If he's trying to win over Obama-Trump voters, he's going to have to make it like he's not trying to take your guns away.
Well, that's going to be... He's literally pulling right out of Australia's 1994 plan. He's pulling right out of Canada's plan. It's a two-part thing primarily. Number one, banning assault weapons and high-capacity magazines, and a national buyback of those weapons, in addition to a handful of other laws. Background checks, closing loopholes, red flag laws.
So what he does actually is he cites the 1994 bans and basically says we need to re-implement those because of their success. So I think, again, the framing here is very good, making sure that he's saying there's nothing new. We did this way back when, 25 years ago we did this. We can do it again now.
Yep. And I mean, we're going to keep coming back to framing, but framing is the thing that brings all these policies together. Joe did this in the past. He's going to do this in the present. He's going to do this in the future.
Framing is what won Donald Trump the 2016 election.
That's
both
very
good
true.
Framing on his behalf and poor framing on Hillary's.
So now that we're talking about framing, let's talk about the issue that's probably framing is the most important for: criminal justice reform.
Yes.
The Trump administration, with the help of the Cush and Cory Booker, passed the First Step Act, which I think was a bipartisan piece of legislation.
It was a huge bipartisan piece. It was one of the three, I think, major commitments that the Democrats wanted to pass when they came into the House.
Yeah, and they actually got it done.
Infrastructure, and I think healthcare, which was kind of their stretch goal, knowing who they're up against.
So what is Biden going to do to build on the First Step Act? Well, he's talking about tackling bail and income-based incarceration, which is exactly right.
So Washington D.C. eliminated bail. So basically, if they arrested someone for a nonviolent crime or they determined that they were no longer a threat, they'd say, "All right, come to court. You're free to go. Come to court."
Bail is regressive. Yeah. It is inherently regressive.
Because if you arrest a millionaire for doing the same thing as someone living off of minimum wage, that millionaire is going to be able to say, "All right, yeah, here's the $10,000 bail, or here's the $100 bail even," but that person on minimum wage might not be able to. So what this did is actually I think the rate of people showing up either slightly increased or decreased by maybe 0.1%. It really does not affect people. All you need to do is let them free and then send them a letter or an email or a text basically saying, "Hey, it's time for you to show up." And most people, show up because they know that not showing up will be so much worse.
Oh, yeah. He's also talking about ending private prisons.
Which
yes,
is
please.
Something that most people don't even think about the fact that they exist, and when they do, it's mind-boggling.
Actually, we need private prisons. Otherwise, Walmart wouldn't be able to sell straws for 1 cent.
Well, that's not just private prisons. That's public prisons also. But anyways.
Point being, end private prisons. If we're going to be doing cheap labor, let's at least have it be in public prisons.
Yeah, I guess.
Maybe not.
Yep. No, prison labor is something that I don't think he mentions. You don't see basically anyone mention, but it is a big
something
deal.
Definitely on the fringes of the left.
Because you know how most Starbucks cups are made by people in prison, or a large amount are made by people in prison. A lot of things, straws, a lot of things like that are made in prisons, and that's really not a good thing, especially because they. If you look at the 14th Amendment, it says that slavery is legal as a punishment of a crime. So, states still use that. We still have slaves. They just committed a crime first.
Yay! Yay! But hey, I mean, maybe they'll be making more things other than Starbucks cups. Joe Biden's calling for $1 billion a year toward juvenile justice reform, and also he's calling for some significant assets to be moved towards setting up a kind of alternate education system for prisons. So, and he's also talking about investing in reentry. Here's an interesting plan, and it's worth saying, and we can talk about it sometime. All incarcerated. This isn't a policy they're going to be pushing towards, but this is a goal that appears on the website. I think is a great goal. All incarcerated peoples will have housing upon reentry.
That's a huge goal.
Talk about reducing recidivism.
Yeah,
rates.
the recidivism rate in America right now is very high, and a lot of it is because they can't find a job and they can't find housing afterwards. So, where can you live for free and eat for free if you commit a petty crime? Or oftentimes it's not even most of the time it's not a conscious choice. It's a desperation thing. It's, I have nothing else to do.
Housing might not be a human right, but it sure will reduce crime if you give it to people after they leave prison.
Absolutely.
So now we move on to Biden's plan for rural America, because this is going to be important for trying to at least decrease the Trump vote in a lot of the rural sectors of Rust Belt states. This is really for central Pennsylvania, I feel like, is what this plan
Central
is for.
PA, Central Ohio, a lot of Wisconsin also.
Yeah, Wisconsin as well. So it doesn't really talk about the trade war.
No, he says we need to pursue a trade policy that works for American farmers. And he makes it very clear that trade policy is not the trade war. He doesn't say, though, that it's free trade. He says that we want to stand up to China by working with our allies to negotiate from the strongest possible position.
It's going to be very difficult for Biden to articulate any kind of policy regarding trade, because because if Biden should be operating assuming that he is going to become the president of the United States. If he is smart and his advisors are smart, not only are they having him walk a line regarding partisan politics, but they're having him walk a line because the Chinese are listening to everything that comes out of his mouth.
And also not interfering in the election already with Twitter, Facebook, any social media or anything like that.
So in addition, he's going to have a new allocate some money for basically helping farmers either upgrade existing technologies, start new businesses.
Yeah, so people who are new farmers or just like beginning a large expansion of their farm can get a loan up to $100,000.
Yeah.
Just to help that through the Department of Agriculture. So probably a pretty low repayment rate on that.
Let's assume.
Yeah.
And then also calling for net zero emissions for farmers and promoting ethanol, which is a win-win.
Yeah, ethanol will increase production of like corn and other products like that, but also help our environment. And let me make that clear that net zero emissions for farmers is something he's not requiring. He's aiding them in.
It's a goal.
It's not you have to do this. We're going to help you reach this point.
And then in addition, talking about just energy, moving to renewables, because really, if we can get farmers to start moving to renewables, then that is a sign that we know we're going to be in the right direction.
Yes.
So, in addition to farmers, we can talk about the next group of people that are really important for Biden.
Old
people. Yay.
By his terminology, older Americans.
Older Americans, yes. Hands off my Medicare. Believe me, Biden's not touching Medicare. He's gonna make it great. I don't know, because it was already great in the first place. So Biden does one thing. I think this is up there with the few smartest things of this whole platform.
Mm-hmm.
He frames the prescription drug issue as an issue for older voters.
That's definitely big.
If Biden can turn out voters against prescription drug companies, he's going to win the election.
Especially because young people generally don't like prescription companies, but old people don't dislike prescription drug companies.
But the entire point of this plank of his platform is talking about how prescription drug companies take advantage of older Americans. If that can become a talking point for him, that will be amazing.
Yes.
And on top of that, he's instituting a bunch of policies to protect He's calling for a bunch more policies to protect Medicare, and something that I am a big fan of. Before I get to that, expanding the earned income tax credit. That has been a white bread Democratic policy for literally 20 years.
Yeah.
But he's talking about a $5,000 tax credit for informal caregivers. So many people need that.
Yes, absolutely.
The sandwich generation, my mother, my mother had to take care of 3 of my grandparents dying in the space of about 7 years. And then all while my sister and I were going through middle school and then high school.
Yeah.
That is the sandwich generation. Not our family, but just her, she would have been able to do so much if she had some kind of assistance for being an informal caregiver.
Yeah.
That's the kind of
it's
plan
a job that literally pays nothing oftentimes. Like your parents obviously don't pay you to take care of them in their old age. Oftentimes they won't have the money, or else they would be able to pay someone to take care of them in their old age. So being able to give some assistance to the people that are helping the aging is a very important thing.
Absolutely. And finally, regarding Social Security, because that's maybe not a plan for old people, but we need our Social Security.
Yeah, it's expected to shrivel up by 2035 at the latest.
He's going to make Social Security solvent, at least this is what Biden says, by getting the wealthy to pay their fair share. So maybe let's talk about how he's going to pay for this, because we've talked about a lot of Biden investments. We talked a lot about Biden policies. How the heck is he going to pay for this? Well, he's actually already released his tax plan, and there's a tax plan. The Tax Policy Institute has done a formal study of it. It is a quite robust tax plan. I will say I've read the whole report. Most people's taxes are only going to go up by a few $100, and I understand that that's a few $100 that at first a lot of people might not be able to afford
or might want to keep in their pockets.
But let's say that you're paying a few $100 a year. How much of that money is going into, for example, $130 billion a year in infrastructure?
Yeah, infrastructure, into your water, into your internet, into your medical bills.
That is money that people can afford to spend if it is going into infrastructure. Now,
Yes.
if you look now, just pulling up the Institute's PDF, if you go to page 4, and we will link to this report on our Facebook and other social medias. If you go to page 4 and you look at the graph, the top 1%. Let me just pull this up here because I feel like it's really important. The top 1% is only responsible, or not only responsible. Damn it, I can't find this. Okay, point being, the top 0.1% is responsible for paying about 92% of the taxes under this plan, and
Yeah.
I think, or 90 is.
That sounds like a lot.
Yeah, it's a really good counter argument, and it's something that I hope the campaign harps on. That a lot of this, it seems like they're really ramping up spending, right? Like calling for hundreds of billions of dollars in some cases, and then $1 trillion elsewhere. You justify it by saying, look, we're going to get these people to pay their fair share. And I know this has been a Democratic talking point forever, but when you have somebody who has the moderate credentials of Biden saying it, and the statistics that the bottom 4 quintiles of income earners are only going to be paying a few more $100, I feel like that's something that can be sold.
Yeah, especially because it's such a, again, framing, and it's an easy argument to make that if they're making hundreds of times more than us, they should be paying hundreds of more times in taxes.
They should be. And it also talks about closing loopholes.
Yes. So
and there's also comprehensive increases for those who are able to pay, and also comprehensive increases for corporates that are able to pay. There's also a significant part of this tax plan that really empowers small and medium-sized enterprises.
Yeah.
Biden is not out here trying to tax small businesses.
Yeah. So lastly, the big plan that we probably need to get to is healthcare. Healthcare, the big thing. So basically, what he wants to do with healthcare is, his main thing is protect Obamacare. So make sure that the Affordable Care Act stays intact the way it was meant to be, so that people, I don't know if he says anything about the individual mandate, but the part that everyone loves about the Affordable Care Act of, the increased protections, the option, healthcare.gov is not disliked anymore now that it's actually functional. But the other things he wants to do, because he doesn't just want to protect Obamacare, because, Obamacare, largely successful, was not successful enough. So what he wants to do is add a public option, or Medicare for all who want it, for those who are Pete fans.
So you.
Yeah, but it's essentially just that there will be a government-owned plan similar to Medicare that's available to buy alongside, any other type of healthcare plan. He also wants to have tax credits to reduce healthcare costs below 8.5% of any person's income, which is really, really a moderate progressive stance. So he wants to make sure that no one's healthcare costs more than 8.5% of their income. And the way they're going to do that
Wait,
is,
wouldn't that halve most people's
Yeah.
healthcare costs?
Yeah.
Because the average is 15%.
Mhm.
There you go.
It's going to almost half healthcare costs. And the way he wants to do that is not by giving money or by lowering the cost of healthcare. It's by giving tax credits, which is the typical like neoconservative viewpoint on how to lower stuff. That's the
Tax credits are kind of I don't want to call tax credits a logical fallacy because they're not, and they can be really helpful. But tax credits, there's an argument out there that tax credits are really only good for educated people because you have to be knowledgeable enough to file for the tax credit, which means one of two things. You're smart enough to file for it yourself, or you are filing enough money in taxes that you're paying for a consultant.
Yeah, and you'll see a lot of Milton Friedman's policies where he was supporting a more liberal than average approach. He paid for it using tax credits. So if you look at UBI,
that's tough.
his UBI was not $1,000 a month given to you in a bank account. It was
Wait, Milton Friedman?
Yeah, he was in favor of UBI.
Right, okay.
By cutting all social benefits and instead giving a $12,000 a year tax cut to everyone, or a tax credit to everyone.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things. Also, he wants to make it so Medicare can negotiate for drug prices. And
something that pretty much everybody supports. I think even Trump called for that at one point.
Yeah, no, he does. And then also he wants to eliminate out-of-network rates during hospitalization or other places out of your control. So if you go to like your normal provider and you have to go to, you know, take a separate test, but the person giving that test is part of another network, oftentimes you're going to have to pay an out-of-network rate even though you're in your own doctor's office.
Which is completely ridiculous. And so it is bringing people back into the fold, making things simpler for most Americans,
and
something that hopefully should be able to be sold relatively easily and that a lot of people can get behind without too many scruples.
And I think it was Joe talking about this at the last debate. He mentioned how if you're in a rush to a hospital, you don't have the time to look up whether or not that hospital's in your group.
You don't have enough time to look up if you're going to have to pay $800 for a
Band-Aid.
$800 for a ambulance ride. That was rough.
There are expensive ambulance rides. There are also, you know, cases where people are paying $100 for a Band-Aid, a few $100s for skin-to-skin contact with their newborns, stuff like that. So hopefully having no more out-of-network rates for emergency events or anything else out of your control.
Now, there's nothing about no more out-of-pocket expenses.
No.
But that seems like sort of an evolution that has no place in Biden's policy right now.
So the last major part of that plan that's a little more surprising is that for new drugs, he wants the Department of Health and Human Services to determine what the maximum price that drug can be sold for. So basically saying, hey, for the first few years, you cannot sell it for more than this price. And whatever that price is, also the even after those 2 years, that price is the maximum for what the Medicare and public option members would pay.
Yep.
So that's already giving a leg up to the people on the public option saying, hey, if you want this prescription drug, you're not going to be paying more than this price, and that's promised by law, not just by a promise.
And as somebody who is not paying for his own health care yet, that is a rather comforting prospect to me.
Yes.
Because most people, if they're going to be staying on their parents' health insurance until they're 26 or until they have some kind of robust form of employment, that the idea that prescription drugs, especially for a lot of people who need prescription drugs to, you know, just exist in their everyday lives, that is something that is a comforting thought to a lot of people. And it just to bring everything together now, the themes of these policies they're very muted in most cases, and hopefully it allows candidates across the Democratic, up and down the ballot to frame them in whatever way best suits their race, while also allowing Biden a lot of room to sort of wiggle around.
And also, it does give a few olive branches to the more progressive base. So, like that HHS determining the price of drugs is very similar to HR 3, which is the drugs being regulated by the international average price of a few other countries. So, as we wrap up here, we definitely recommend that you take a look at all of his other policies and the ones we mentioned. We only were able to talk about probably half, maybe a little bit less. He also has sections that summarize his policies in the frame of Latinx voters and black voters and Catholic voters, which is something you don't see anywhere else. So if you go to like joebiden.com/Catholics, you'll go to this page that basically says his policies only for Catholics.
And there's also, we didn't talk about climate change. We didn't talk about truly like transformative economic systems, which is a part of his policy and a plan for the middle class. Due to the fact that the primary is effectively over now, we're going to be having some guests on in the future and having some conversations a lot more about policy, especially since it seems we're heading toward a general between these two old white grandpas.
Yeah, but remember, it's not just this election. So we're also hopefully very soon going to have some guests on who are going to be running for office and possibly maybe in office.
Absolutely. We can't confirm anything yet, but when we can, we will let you all know as soon as possible.
Yes, so it is now 8:05 p.m., so our time is a little bit up for this Thursday evening.
Our intro and outro music is by Paul Abrams and Rock Solid Panda, produced by Elise Duda. Our signal monitors are James Walsh and Nick Delisio.
You can find a recording of this podcast on our YouTube channel, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever else you hear your podcasts. And make sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to stay updated on air times, episode topics, and any upcoming guests.
We welcome your comments, your feedback, and your suggestions. It's 8:05. Stay with us on WDSR. Have a good Friday and a great weekend.